Well, good afternoon, everyone. Here we are in the library of the RAF Club in Piccadilly, London. Very fine location, and a very appropriate location for what I'm going to be talking about today. The date is actually 17th of September, and this week has been Battle of Britain Week. Battle of Britain Day itself is 15th of September, and it's been quite a week. It's always quite a week to celebrate because the Battle of Britain was a very well-known battle. It was the first great air battle, and it was a very important battle in the Second World War. I'm passionate about the Battle of Britain for many reasons. One, because my father was a Battle of Britain pilot, one of the few, and because I myself am an ex-RAF fighter pilot, second generation fighter pilot, and it means just a lot to me. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, the Battle of Britain. So I think just to set the scene, I've already said this is the 81st anniversary of the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain took place in 1940. The actual dates, official dates, are the 10th of July to the 31st of October 1940. To set the scene a bit more, the war started on the 1st of September, it's World War II now, on the 1st of September 1939, and fairly rapidly Hitler and the Nazis invaded most countries in Europe, and then in particular the speed at which they invaded France took everybody rather by surprise. At that stage, the British and the RAF had an expeditionary force in France. In fact, my father, who was a South African, had actually been recruited into the Royal Air Force in southern Rhodesia, one of 11 who was recruited by the Royal Air Force, and they shipped him across in 1938 to train as a pilot. And at the start of the war, he'd just been trained, and he was flying ferry battles actually. And he, September 1939 to June 1940, he was in France flying ferry battles before he had to evacuate France when the Germans invaded that country. They invaded that country. We withdrew as many forces as we could. Obviously, that led to Dunkirk itself, and Dunkirk is a separate one, but I think most people know what a great effort that was to recover so many people back to this country. My father, as I said, he had to evacuate. Most of the ferry battles were destroyed in France. Most of the ferry battle pilots were killed, actually. I often wonder how my father survived, but he did. How he survived the war, but more about that later on. So he came back, and then he joined Fighter Command and was retrained on the Hurricane and straight into the Battle of Britain. So that really sort of sets the scene, because there we were, the Germans had really invaded the whole of Europe, and the next place on their target list was England. And they had intended, they wanted to invade England. It was known as Operation Sea Lord, in fact, and but they had realised that before they could invade England, they would have to get air superiority over the skies, and that would mean defeating the Royal Air Force, and that is what the Battle of Britain was all about. The Battle of Britain itself was divided into 4 phases. The first phase, the Germans attacked shipping in the Channel and also coastal ports. The second, I'm not going to give you the dates exactly, but the second led on to a second phase when they started attacking the airfields and continued with their attacks on ports and other things. And then the third phase, when they sort of brought their attacks more inland to cover more airfields. And then the third phase really was when the Hitler made a decision. He made a decision on the 5th of September, actually, 1940, to basically switch the attacks away from the airfields and attack London. And that is what we know as the Blitz. This was, what he didn't know was this was probably the best thing that could have happened, because the RAF was really stretched. They weren't defeated, but they were stretched. They were running out of pilots, and they were running out of aircraft. And the fact that he sort of switched, and the airfields themselves have been taking a fair old hammering. The fact that he switched away from the airfields to London gave the RAF time to get more pilots posted in, where they were retrained in very few weeks as well, and also re-equipped with sort of more aircraft. More of that should go through. On the numbers of aircraft, at the start of the Battle of Britain, the German numbers of aircraft significantly outnumbered the RAFs. The Germans had a force of about 3,000 aircraft. Most of those were actually bombers, but 980, I think it was, thereabouts, were fighters. The RAF, the numbers of fighters that the RAF had, it varies, but I know I saw an official number only this week that said they had 790. Whatever, they were outnumbered. And so the battle started, and we know that there were some great air battles. We've seen paintings, we've seen pictures that took place over Kent and also the Channel and elsewhere. There were some big raids in September. And I'm going to particularly concentrate on the area around about September the 15th, what's happened in September, around the Battle of Britain Day. Because I already said that on September the 5th, Hitler switched his raids to London, mainly. On the September the 15th was a big day for several reasons. One, because, first of all, Hitler had postponed Operation Sea Lord, which he had actually planned to take place in early September. He had postponed it, I'm told, to the 24th of September. Now, on the 15th of September, Battle of Britain Day, there were two big raids on the UK, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And both these raids numbered 250 plus aircraft. They were bombers supported by Messerschmitt 109s, the fighters. And these big raids were met by the RAF, who were not defeated, were never defeated, and of course because Hitler had switched his targeting, had enabled the RAF to replenish stocks of pilots and stocks of aircraft. These big raids took place, and at the end of the raids of that day, the Germans had suffered heavy losses, far heavier losses than the RAF had suffered. And the reason this is important is because it was on that day that Hitler made the decision to postpone Operation Sea Lord. He decided, I cannot go ahead with it. So that was the day that the decision was made not to invade England. Now, just talking about the battles themselves, 250 aircraft is a lot of aircraft in the sky. Now, I myself am a fighter pilot, and I've fought in mock battles with 2 aircraft, with 4 aircraft, with 10 aircraft, with 20 aircraft, maybe sometimes with 30 aircraft. And I know what sort of an air battle with that number of aircraft is like. It is every man for himself. So you can imagine sort of what it must have been like with squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires up, getting intermingled with 250 plus bombers and 109s. It's worth just saying at this time that the main aircraft, there were lots of aircraft involved in the Battle of Britain, many more than the Spitfires and the Hurricanes that we hear talked about all the time, and the 109s. There were other aircraft during the Battle of Britain involved. I won't actually go through them because some of them, the Defiant, the Blenheim, the Gladiator, the Lysander, they all had a small part to play, but not of the significance of the Hurricanes and the Spitfires. The Hurricane, it's worth saying, was the workhorse of the Battle of Britain, and it was also the aircraft that scored the most kills. The Spitfire was the glamour boy, and the bombers, which were Dorniers and Heinkels and Junkers, were targets for the Hurricanes, because they did not have quite the performance of the Spitfire, although it wasn't far off, they were really targeted at the bombers. Whereas the Spitfire, which had a better turning performance than the Hurricane, and could get higher, you went higher, and they were there to deal with the 109s. In practice, what happened when you got into the battle, that it was, as I said, it was every man for himself. And this is where I can only sort of imagine what it must have been. I know that these were mainly young men who flew these aircraft. You hear about Battle Britain pilots. The average age was, I think, about 21 or so. There were young chaps who come straight out of school, some of them, straight out of university, and straight, after very little training, into the battle. If you think of what your son looks like at the age of 20, then that's what they were. They were young men. I remember when I was 20, I didn't have much fear in those days. Not saying I've got much fear now, but they were pretty fearless. They must have been probably frightened before, and I know many of them were. But when you get in the cockpit, and I know when you get in the cockpit and you strap yourself, you just do the job, and you really sort of you forget the fear factor. But this leads me on to just talk about the training. They hadn't had much training. They did say that if you survived the first 10 flights into combat, then you stood a good chance of surviving. And there's a meaning behind that, because these men went in, they were raw. They didn't know what it was like to be in combat, apart from the little bit of training that they'd done. And that is why so many young people got shot down, sort of, some of them on their very first sortie into combat. The one thing you learn as you go through that sort of environment, because you have to learn, is to survive. And if you don't know how to survive, that, I'm sure, is what carried my father through the Air Force, through the war, because he fought in France, he fought in the Battle of Britain, he fought in Malta, and he fought in Ceylon. He's got many kills, he's an ace. He was shot down twice. But I know, from being a fighter pilot myself, the one thing you've got to do is learn how to survive. And many of those people who got shot down probably wouldn't even know that their assailant was there. Now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about a few of the pilots, just to give an example. A few of them that we know here in the Royal Air Force Club. There's a well-known pilot called Geoffrey Wellham, who was 19. They say he was about the youngest pilot in the Battle of Britain. But he was 19 when he went into battle flying Spitfires with 92 Squadron, the squadron that I was on flying Lightnings many years later. But he was flying Spitfires, 92 Squadron at Biggin Hill. And he wrote a best-selling book called First Light. And if one hasn't read that book, I do recommend getting it and reading it, because it's a very good description of what it was like to be a pilot, not just in the Spitfire, but in the Battle of Britain, in the war. So he's one. He only died a few years ago. We used to see him often here in the Royal Air Force Club in London. The second man I want to mention just briefly is a chap called Peter Pease. Again, here in the club we've got a painting of Peter Pease hanging in the bar known as the Churchill bar. Peter, I mention him because he joined the Air Force. He went to Eton. Believe it or not, he was one of 22 Eton boys who flew in the Battle of Britain, and 8 of them died. Eton, funnily enough, was the school that had the most pilots of any of the schools in the Battle of Britain. He was killed. He was killed on September the 15th, 1940. So I mentioned him partly because he's just an example. He'd been to Eton, he went to Cambridge University. He was the son of Sir Richard and Lady Pease from Richmond in North Yorkshire. He was very much a sort of a man of the times, and he had a golden future in front of him. A good-looking chap, a brilliant academic. He had everything going for himself, and he just got engaged. but he was killed in the Battle of Britain. So that didn't happen. So we remember him. He was also, incidentally, a great friend of another chap who'd been at university with him and was on the same squadron as he was, a chap called Richard Hillary, who was himself shot down in the Battle of Britain and suffered very bad burns. He wrote a best-selling book in the war, in fact, called The Last Enemy, which again talks of his time flying and being burnt, what it was like. And that is also another book worth reading. Then there's a chap called Teddy Donaldson. Teddy Donaldson, and I mention him because I'm very good friends with another ex-Air Force officer called Julian Stapleton. And Teddy was his stepfather, in fact. He'd actually been he was 28 in the Battle of Britain. And he was officer commanding of 151 Squadron at North Weald in Essex. And he talks a lot about. He went on after the war. He survived the war. He went on to hold the world airspeed record in 1946, and then when he left the RAF, he became the air correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. 25 years after the battle, he was asked to write some words about the Battle of Britain, and this is what he wrote. He says, "History has recorded the facts. We did not know we were making history. We were fighting for our lives and the lovely green fields that lay below. As we saw them then, from the scarred surface of Northfield Aerodrome, on the outskirts of beautiful Epping Forest, northeast of London, the personalities of the Battle of Britain were Winston Churchill, whom we worshipped and who inspired us beyond belief. After a bad day, we would be having a weary and depressing beer before trying to get some sleep. It must be remembered that in the latter stages of the Battle of Britain, we were bombed at night too." That was also phase 4 of the Battle of Britain. Then out of the radio loudspeakers would come the voice of this great Britain saying, "We will fight, we will never surrender." The next day, feeling as if we had a shot of dope in the arm, we would go back into the fray as new men, determined never to be beaten. This is the effect Churchill had on us. And I think that's very important because Churchill, I know from all the Battle of Britain pilots I spoke to, he was an absolute inspiration to the Battle of Britain pilots. Then there's Stuffy Dowdy, our Commander-in-Chief. We respected him as a good commander, but did not know him intimately as he was too busy to visit us often. But he endeared himself to us by turning a blind eye when pilots helped themselves to a little aviation spirit to drive to London and let their hair down. Dowdy was a very important man in the Battle of Britain. The Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command, his part, I'll come back to it in a little while, was not just in the Battle of Britain, it started a long time before. But more about that in just a moment. Then there's Keith Park, our Group Commander, a New Zealander, dedicated to winning the battle and conducting it without fear or favour in the most ruthless manner. We liked him as a good man who often flew a hurricane in those dark days. Those three were really the architects, the heroes of the Battle of Britain. Winston Churchill, Lord Dowding and Keith Park. Then there's Victor Beamish, the station commander of North Weald, a real fighting Irishman who inspired us by fighting with us and drinking with us, but always found the time to look after our every need. We remember also the widows of the pilots killed. I had a dozen or so on my hands at one time. We had to get the RAF Benevolent Fund to help them temporarily as they missed their husband's pay, which had stopped somewhat suddenly. Finally, we remember the opponents. We never hated the Luftwaffe, and I never saw a cowed German. We knew they were killing our countrymen, but we thought of them as men obeying orders and doing their duty. We had the same orders and the same duty when we struck back at Germany later on. I read those words because I think they're very true words. But if I just now go back to Lord Dowding, and because he had vision. In the mid-1930s, it was he primarily, who saw the need, saw what was coming, and saw the need to make preparations. The Battle of Britain, what happened in the Battle of Britain, didn't just happen because it happened because Britain had been preparing for it to happen. Fighter Command and the sectors. The UK was separated, it was into groups. The main groups we're talking about is 11 Group, which was down in the southeast of England. That's where the majority of the battle took place, but not only there were other places too. 11 Group was headed up by Keith Park. There was 12 Group with Lee Mallory, 13 Group, and there was other groups as well. So it was organised, and the airfields, obviously there were a lot of airfields around. And sectors, each sector had its fighter command itself was at RAF Bentley Priory, a very fine place, and that is from where Lord Dowding conducted the battle. And that is where you've seen these lovely pictures of ladies pushing with big maps on tables, plotters, and that's where they sort of plotted the battle, what was going on. Then there were sort of sectors, in sector operations rooms. There were the individual sectors which went out to the stations, controlled the battle from there as well. But Dowding himself had seen it coming, and it wasn't just aircraft that were being built. We didn't have enough at the start of the battle, and they kept on coming online. But there was a thing called radar, which the Germans weren't really sort of familiar with the fact what was happening, and they were surprised when they saw British fighters pitching up where their aircraft were. They wondered how they managed to be in the right place at the right time, and that was because of a thing called chain radar. Because the RAF had built a system of radars that it was covered the medium level to the high level, and there was a separate radar that covered the lower levels. Very basic by modern standards, but it was a radar that played a very important part in the battle. And when you see these ladies pushing things around on a map, those are aircraft, and that's where they're plotting, and that's how they organise which squadron to send into battle at any one particular time. So fighter command and sectors were an important part. We must never forget the ground crews and the other station support personnel, the people who serviced and kept the aircraft and mended them when they came back with holes in them and worse, and put them back together again overnight. They played a very major part in the battle, as did the station support personnel, whether it was medical staff or admin staff. There's some very brave things done on the stations. The radar, I've mentioned that. The Royal Observer Corps, the organisation that had people to look for aircraft in the sky, they played a very important part. Industry played an important part. The aircraft, we had to build aircraft like they'd never been built before, and industry did respond, and it got better and better. So the aircraft came out, but then still there weren't pilots to go and collect them and bring them back, so they had to be delivered. And there was another organisation called the Air Transport Auxiliary, which was manned by both men and women, particularly the women, who used to fly the aircraft, deliver them to the squadrons. That is how the squadrons and stations were replenished with new aircraft stocks. The pilots were all trained elsewhere, and they were churned out very quickly indeed after, in some cases, only a few weeks of training. And I know, having done training, my training lasted 3 years, I know just how raw they must have been. What I'm getting around to saying is that the Battle of Britain itself, the pilots who we read about and know about, known as the few, who did all the, who were the ones who were actually sort of doing the killing and being killed mainly. But they couldn't have done that without the supporting cast that I've talked about. The Battle of Britain was very much a team effort. And actually, when I'm talking about the RAF, I am talking about the RAF, but one mustn't forget the role that the Navy actually played a part. They had aircraft involved, they had pilots involved, and they played a part as well. I just want to mention the pilots themselves, how many of them were, where they came from. There were actually, and the numbers do vary, because they keep on finding additional pilots who were qualified. And to qualify as a Battle of Britain pilot, one of the few, and get the clasp on the Battle of Britain on their medals, they had to have flown at least one operational sortie between the dates of the 10th of July 1940 and the 31st of October 1940. So there were 2,937 pilots. Of these, 2,342 were from Great Britain. 112 came from Canada, 32 from Australia, 12 from New Zealand, 13 from France, 145 from Poland. The Poles did a great job. The Poles, they hated the Germans because, remember, at the start of the war, Poland had been invaded. They had escaped from Poland, and they found their way to England by all sorts of means, by perhaps going down to the Mediterranean and coming up through France into England. But a lot of them did, and a lot of them then joined the Royal Air Force and joined Polish squadrons at places like Northolt, and they were real killers. Some of the Polish squadrons got an enormous number of kills, and some of the Polish pilots as well. 145 from Poland. Also, in the same situation, Czechoslovakia. There were 88 from Czechoslovakia. 25 from South Africa. My father was one of the South Africans. 10 from Ireland. 9 from the USA. The ones from America, these are Americans who'd come across and just wanted to get in the fight and join the RAF. Because remember, when the Battle of Britain took place, America was not in the war. They didn't join the war till later, when Pearl Harbor happened in late 1941. There were 28 from Belgium, 3 from Southern Rhodesia, 1 from Barbados, and 1 from Jamaica. So, as you can see, sort of that too was very much a team effort. And in fact, a lot of the aircraft that were provided by countries. The squadron I was on, in fact, was number 92 Squadron, known as 92 East India Squadron. Why was it known as East India Squadron? Because funds had been provided from East India to equip the squadron, and other squadrons were in the same boat. And individuals and organisations contributed to funding these squadrons. So the Battle of Britain was an amazing sort of, I can just picture it. I love listening to people talking about it, those who saw it. I have one big regret in my life, and that is that I was not able to speak more with my father about the Battle of Britain. The older I get myself, I find myself becoming more and more passionate about the battle. And I've learned a lot about it. But I would love to have talked to him more. Not that he would have spoken, because when I did try and speak to him, he was always very reluctant, as most of them were, to talk about the war. He'd had to have a good few glasses of wine before he'd open up a talk. Now, what about today? Today, 81 years after the battle, it's really important that we continue to remember. And we must continue to remember, because the result of the Battle of Britain, if it had been different, believe me, life would be probably, in all probability, very different for us living in England now, in the UK. Who knows whether we'd be speaking German or or whatever, but it would have been different. And so, in the words of Winston Churchill, never was so much owed by so many to so few. Those words ring in my ears every day, and they are absolutely true. But what about today? And there's only one Battle of Britain pilot still alive as I'm speaking now. His name is John Hemingway, and he lives in Ireland, and he's now 101. And very soon there'll be none. But it's very important that the young are reminded of why they enjoy the freedom that we do today. And that is what I'm personally very passionate about. And I've said some years ago now, I said as long as I'm in this world, I will do everything possible to preserve the memory of the Battle of Britain pilots, the Battle of Britain, and everybody involved, and what it means for this country. And I will do everything possible to promote the Battle of Britain, the memory of it, because it's really important. And as I'm going to just say a few words now about what there is to see, because there is a lot to see. And people, I don't think a lot of people really know this. I take the fighter command, Bentley Priory, no longer an RAF base, but there's a museum there. The building where Dowding controlled the battle from is still there. Dowding's room is still there. £5 or £6 million has been spent. I think it came from lottery money and other places to refurbish and create a museum there. And there's the Battle of Britain Museum at Bentley Priory is a very important place for people to go and visit. Similarly, at Uxbridge is the only example of a sector operations room to be seen, or a main operations room to be seen. And there's a bunker at Uxbridge where you can go today and you can physically see what the room looked like on Battle of Britain Day, September the 15th, 1940. I've been there, it's well underground, and I've been there. My father was actually at RAF Kennedy at the time, flying Hurricanes with 253 Squadron. And I can look at the board and I can see exactly what he was doing on September the 15th. And that is very interesting. But there's more to that, because £5 or £6 million again has been spent on building a visitor centre at the top of the entrance to the bunker, where you've got all the modern technologies, virtual reality, things like that. Again, it's a place that people should go and see. Biggin Hill is probably the most famous fighter base of the lot. It's now very much still, Biggin Hill is still operating. It's now very much associated with business aviation, but there is a museum there to be seen. There's the Battle of Britain Chapel at Biggin Hill to visit and see. And there's another organisation called the Heritage Hangar, the Battle of Britain, the Heritage Hangar at Biggin Hill, where you can see Spitfires and Hurricanes being restored. Actually, there are more Spitfires in the Heritage Hangar than anywhere else in this country. And I think the last count there are something like 45 Spitfires in the United Kingdom still. Then I mentioned my father was at RAF Kennedy, because actually Kennedy, near Croydon in Surrey, the airfield is still there, just as it was in 1940. The runways are the same, but it apart from gliding, that's the only flying that really takes place there now. Funnily enough, I'd never been to Kennedy until about a month ago. And I arranged a visit and I was given a conducted tour of it, and I was really moved by what I saw, by the airfield itself. You could walk around it, and it was you could still see the marks of the Battle of Britain. You could still see the revetments, things like that. The places where the Hurricanes and Spitfires were located around the airfield. The officers' mess, although it's been sold, but it's there to be seen. What I'm saying really is, you could just get a feel for what the Battle of Britain, what was there in the battle, and you can feel it. And I do recommend that as well. But now the most important place, as far as I'm concerned, is a place called Capel le Fern, which is near Folkestone. It sits on the White Cliffs, and on a good day you can look out over France just as the view would have been in the war. You can imagine the battles taking place above you, but that is where the Battle of Britain Memorial is. It's well worth going to Capel le Fern, not just to see the memorial, but to see the location. And importantly, again, millions of pounds have been spent on building a place called the Wing. It's built in an elliptical wing shape of a Spitfire, and in that wing is a presentation called the Scramble Experience. That is where everybody should go and visit the Scramble Experience. I talked about Geoffrey Wellham earlier on. I know Geoffrey's he already died. He went there and actually sort of viewed the Scramble Experience on 3 or 4 occasions. And every time he viewed that, he came out with tears in his eyes. It is so real. It is just that they start with a film which shows what a Battle of Britain pilot was feeling like. It showed fear, it showed lack of fear, it showed bravery, it showed the age of the men, what it was like waiting to be scrambled, coming back with others not coming back. And there's nothing that the Scramble Experience doesn't describe for anybody. You can see absolutely anything you want there. And I've said that anybody, as far as I'm concerned, who's got a British passport, quite frankly, there should be a rule of owning that passport, that at some time in their life they go to Capel le Fern to see the Scramble Experience, because it is so important to be reminded of why we have the freedom that we do in this country now, and particularly the young. I don't know what's happening in the schools today, whether they get educated about the Battle of Britain, but they should be. But it's very important that they understand the bravery of their forebears and why they have the freedom now. Now, I'm sure I've left a lot out in that little move around, but that really is the story of the Battle of Britain as I remember it. There are books and books and books have been written about it. There are, to be an ace, you had to have shot down 5 or 6 aircraft to be an ace. My father was an ace. Some people became aces in a day in the Battle of Britain. Some people became aces during the Battle of Britain. Others became aces during the war. Others never became aces. It's just so special, the Battle of Britain.